The Montana sky hung low and gray over the crossroads. A clean-coated rider swung down from a lathered horse and left it standing untethered, as if the ground itself already belonged to him. He stepped onto the porch of the patched timber station and set a leather folder on the counter. The papers inside claimed the land under every boot in the room had never been theirs. Silence settled like dust after a long ride. Behind the counter, a woman with a dark stain of birthmark running from temple to jaw did not flinch. 3 years earlier, fire had taken everything she built. 6 towns had already closed their doors on the sight of her face. She had nothing left to lose that leaving would cost her. Yet she opened a tin box of her own tallies, receipts, a land filing paid from the same bank the rider used. Outside, the first true frost silvered the yard. In 3 weeks, a federal surveyor would walk this ground with a measuring chain. The rider's smile never reached his eyes. Something was about to break. Larkspur Crossing did not look like much in the rain. Mud to the ankle. A church with a bell nobody rang before 9. And the Ashby house, 3 stories of gray clapboard, sitting at the crossroads like it had been waiting there since the beginning of the world, deciding who was allowed to eat. Verity Coombs stood on the back step with her hands folded in front of her apron. New apron. Bought that morning with the last coin she meant to spend on herself for a long while. Because she'd told herself this one would be different. She told herself that before. Mrs. Prudence Odell opened the door with a smile already fixed in place. The kind of smile a woman wears when she has decided ahead of time exactly how kind she intends to be, and not 1 ounce more. You must be the girl from the agency. Coombs. Verity Coombs. Yes. A pause. Small. Almost nothing. Come in out of the wet. Verity stepped inside, warm air, bread rising somewhere behind the wall. For 1 whole minute, she let herself believe it. She should have known better than that. Mrs. Odell walked her through the kitchen. Talked about wages. Talked about the boarders. 12 of them. Freight men mostly. Rough but paying. Talked about the schedule. Up at 4, bread by 6. And Verity nodded at every line of it like a woman memorizing scripture. Then Mrs. Odell turned around fully, under the lamp this time. Not the doorway shadow. The lamp. And she stopped talking. Verity watched it happen. She always watched it happen. The eyes moving first to the left side of her face, where the birthmark spread dark red from her temple down along her jaw, like wine spilled once and never wiped away. Then the eyes dropping, quick, ashamed of themselves, down the rest of her. The apron, the arms, the body that had never once, in 31 years, been the kind of body an innkeeper wanted, standing where the boarders could see it. I don't believe, Mrs. Odell said slowly, that this will suit after all. Verity did not move. You hired me an hour ago. Circumstances change. What circumstances? Mrs. Odell's mouth tightened. I have men who pay to sit at my table. I have to think of what they expect to see when they sit down to it. You mean food. I mean the whole picture, Miss Coombs. The whole picture. Verity had heard that phrase in 6 towns now. 6. She had started keeping count somewhere around the 3rd one, the way a person keeps count of anything that keeps happening whether they want it to or not. There had been Mrs. Kirshner in Bitterroot Falls, who hired her for the wash house and then found her a stall in the barn instead, because the wash house had a window facing the road. There had been old Pruitt, not this Prout, a different man entirely, at a hotel in Sweetwater, who told her outright that his wife's cousin needed the position more, though no cousin ever came. There had been the boarding house in Miles Ferry, where she lasted 4 days before a guest complained, not about her cooking, never about her cooking, only about having to look at her while he ate it. 6 towns, 6 kitchens she was never quite allowed to leave. 6 versions of the same sentence, dressed up different ways so a person might almost mistake it for something new each time. She picked her bag back up off the floor. It weighed nothing. It had weighed nothing for 3 years. Everything she owned fit inside it, and most days that felt less like traveling light and more like there had simply stopped being anything left to carry. You'll want your apron back, Mrs. Odell said, not unkindly. That was somehow worse. Keep it. Verity walked out into the rain. She did not cry. She had used up the crying 2 towns back, in a boarding house doorway in a place whose name she had already let herself forget, and what was left now sat lower than tears. Flatter, quieter, a kind of tiredness that lived in the joints instead of the eyes. Because that's the trick nobody tells you, she thought, walking, mud sucking at her boots, that it doesn't break you all at once. It just takes a little more each time, until one day you notice there's less of you standing there than there used to be. And you go on anyway, because what else is there? You get up, you count the coin, you walk to the next town and the next kitchen, and you tell yourself this time. Except there is no this time. There is only the same time, wearing a different woman's face at the door. She stopped that thought before it went further. She had learned to stop those thoughts before they went further. It was, if she was honest, the one skill 3 years of this life had actually improved in her. Not her cooking, not her figures, though those had always been sound. Just the stopping. The way she could feel a memory rising in her chest, like water behind a dam, and simply deliberately turn her attention somewhere else before it broke through. Today it wanted to be the fire. It was always, eventually, the fire. 3 years, she thought, and let herself have this much of it, just this much, walking through the mud with nowhere in particular to be. 3 years since the storm. Since the shelf came down in the storeroom, and the lamp went with it, and I woke up not to the bell, but to smoke already thick along the ceiling, thick enough to taste before I understood what I was tasting. I counted heads. That was the thing. Even half asleep, even choking, I counted. 9 rooms, 9 doors, and I went down that hall pounding on every one of them, and every single guest walked out that night. Every one. I would tell that to anyone who asked, if anyone ever asked, which they mostly didn't, because the story people wanted was the fire, not the counting. Because after the counting, after the guests stood shivering in their nightclothes in the road, watching the east wing go, watching it eat through timber, I had chosen myself, board by board. 5 years of choosing after that, I went back in. For the ledger, for the strong box with Louisa's passage money, folded inside an old church hymnal, where I thought no thief would look, for the small, foolish human need to save something, anything that would prove the 5 years had been real and not just smoke waiting its turn. Amos Pruitt would call that a fool decision. He'd be right too. I got the ledger. I did not get the hymnal. The roof came down 11 feet behind me, and a beam caught my arm on the way out, and I still have the mark of it under my sleeve where nobody thinks to look, because they are all so busy looking at the other mark, the one on my face, the one that was there before the fire and will be there after every fire that ever comes for me again. Funny, that. A woman can carry 2 scars her whole life, and the world will only ever ask about the one that was never her fault to begin with. She turned her attention to her boots instead, to the mud, to the particular gray of a Montana sky, deciding whether to keep raining or simply sit there being miserable about it all afternoon. The road out of Larkspur Crossing ran past the freight yard, and the freight yard was where she heard the shouting. Not angry shouting. Frustrated. A man's voice, and under it the creak of wagon wheels settling, and a woman's voice trying to talk over both. That cannot be the count. I ordered 11 sacks, Mr. Guthrie, and I intend to pay for 11 sacks, and not one more. I'm telling you what's on the paper, ma'am. Paper, says 11. Then somebody has made an error with the paper. Verity slowed without deciding to, because there, beside a supply wagon stacked with flour sacks, stood a young woman in a shopkeeper's coat, Odette Finch. The dry goods sign above her wagon read, though Verity would not learn the name until later, red in the face, arguing with a teamster twice her size. And past them, half in the wagon bed, half out, stood a man. Tall, sun-browned at the neck, sleeves shoved up past the elbow, with flour dust ground into the forearm, like it had been there so long. It had stopped being dirt and started being skin. He was not part of the argument. He was only watching it, watching the sacks, counting something with his eyes, the way a man counts things he already susses are wrong. aunt, and is only waiting for the numbers to catch up with his suspicion. Verity looked at the sacks too. 11 claimed. She counted 9. She should have kept walking. She did not keep walking. 9, she said. Miss Finch turned. Excuse me? There are 9 sacks, not 11. Verity nodded toward the wagon bed. Count the stitched ones at the back, separate from the loose-tied ones up front. Whoever loaded this wagon charged you for 2 that never left the mill. Silence. The teamster's face went a slow, guilty red. Miss Finch looked from Verity to the sacks and back again. Quick, like she was trying to catch the truth before it changed its mind. Show me, she said. Verity walked over, set her bag down in the mud without a second thought, because some habits were older and stronger than the small vanity of keeping a bag clean, and pulled the loose-tied sacks forward one at a time. Here, here, and here. Stitched close, mill marks still fresh. These other 2, she tapped them. Older ties. Different hand did the knots. Somebody pulled these off a half-load from last week and folded them in with today's count. The teamster opened his mouth, closed it again. That true, Guthrie? The tall man in the wagon said. Quiet, not accusing yet, just asking. Guthrie's silence answered for him. Miss Finch's jaw set like a woman who had just discovered exactly how much money she had been quietly losing, for who knew how long, and did not care for the discovery one bit. I'll be speaking to the mill directly, she said, and stalked off toward her own wagon, already composing, by the look of her, several very sharp letters in her head. Then she stopped, turned back. Thank you, she said to Verity, and there was something almost startled in the way she said it, like a woman surprised to find herself grateful to a stranger on the muddiest, least dignified afternoon of her month. I don't believe I caught your name. Coombs. Well, Miss Coombs, if you're ever wanting steady custom, my shop takes flour by the week, and I do not soon forget who saves me $2 in an afternoon. She was gone before Verity could answer, up onto her own wagon seat, still muttering about the mill, and Guthrie the teamster was already backing his wagon around, with considerably more haste than he had shown, arriving, eager it seemed to be anywhere else, before anyone thought to ask him further questions about knots. The tall man climbed down off the wagon. He looked at the sacks, then at Verity, not at her face first. That was the thing she noticed later, lying awake turning the day over like a coin. He looked at the sacks first, and only after that did his eyes come up to hers, and when they did, they stayed there. Not long enough to be rude about it. Not the quick flinch and drop she had gotten used to reading like a language, just long enough to be honest. How'd you count that so fast, he said. I've counted a great many flour sacks in my life. For who? Myself, mostly. I ran an inn once. Ran. Past tense. She heard herself say it and felt the old ache underneath the word, the one she never let anybody see, the one that had a fire in it and a family in it, and things she was not going to think about, standing in a muddy freight yard in front of a stranger. He climbed down off the wagon. Thaddeus Rourke, he said. Everybody calls me Thad. Verity Coombs. He did not offer his hand, just nodded, once like a man confirming something to himself. You looking for work, Miss Coombs? Behind her faint, she thought she heard a door close. Mrs. Odell's, maybe. Or maybe just the wind. Either way, something in her chest wanted to laugh, and something else in her chest wanted to run, and she did neither. Depends what kind. I run a freight station 12 miles south. Kestrel Station. Lost my cook a month back. Lost most of my sense along with her. Looks like, because I've been keeping my own books since, and they don't balance no matter how many times I add them. You want a cook? I want somebody who can count sacks faster than a man who's been standing here doing it for the better part of an hour. Verity studied him, waited for the next part. The part where he explained, kindly or not, that the kitchen was in the back, that the counter was no place for her, that customers would not care for the sight of her while they ate. The next part did not come. Where would I be working? She asked. Careful. Kitchen. Or counter. Something crossed his face. Not to. Confusion closer to insult and not at her. Counters where the money's lost, he said. So that's where you'd be. You mean where customers can see me? I mean where the customers are. Those aren't the same thing to most men who have offered me work." He was quiet a moment, long enough that she braced herself, out of old habit, for whatever soft refusal usually followed a silence that length. "I've got one cook short, and a station bleeding money every week. I don't fix it," he said finally. "I don't have the luxury of walls to hide people behind, Miss Coombs. Everybody works where the work is." She looked at him a long moment. He didn't look away, she thought. He hasn't looked away once. "2 weeks," she said. "Paid. Every Saturday. And if a customer objects to being served by me, then he can decide how hungry he is." It was the smallest joke. Barely a joke at all. But something in her chest loosened half an inch, the way a hinge does after years of rust. Not free yet, just less stuck than it was. "All right, Mr. Rourke." "Thad?" "Mr. Rourke," she said again, and something that might have been the ghost of a smile moved at the corner of his mouth. He went to see about the rest of his delivery then, and Verity stood a moment longer in the mud, alone, turning the last 5 minutes over in her mind, the way a person turns over a coin they suspect might be counterfeit, checking it from every angle before they trust it enough to spend it. 12 miles south, she thought. A man I have known the length of one argument over flour sacks. A station I have not seen. A counter I am apparently meant to stand behind in plain sight of every teamster on that road, which is either the kindest offer I have received in 3 years or the setup to a cruelty more patient than any I have met yet. "Stop it," she told herself. "You have done this arithmetic before, standing in worse mud than this, and the answer has never once changed. You have nothing left to lose that leaving would cost you, and everything to gain that staying might. Those are not difficult numbers, Verity. Stop making them difficult simply because you are frightened of the one time they might actually be true." Guthrie the teamster, still loading the last of Miss Finch's flour, watched her with open curiosity as she stood there, thinking, and finally could not help himself. "You really runnin' in, ma'am?" "I did." "What happened to it?" "Here it comes," she thought. The question that usually arrives right before the retreat, right before somebody decides a woman with a story like mine, is more trouble than her arithmetic is worth. "Fire," she said plain, and waited for him to find some reason to busy himself elsewhere. He only nodded, slow, like a man filing the fact away without attaching any particular judgment to it. "Rourke's a fair boss," he said instead. "Fairer than most on this stretch. You could do worse. I intend to find out." Thad came back around the wagon then, gestured her toward his own, and Verity picked up her bag, light as it always was, and climbed up onto the seat beside a stranger, toward a station she had never seen, on the strength of nothing more than the way a man's eyes had gone to flour sacks, before they had gone to her face. It was not much to build a decision on. It was, she thought, watching Larkspur Crossing shrink small behind them, rather more than she had been given to build on in a very long while. The wagon ride south took the better part of the afternoon, and Verity spent most of it saying nothing at all, because there was a version of this conversation where she told him everything right away. The inn, the fire, the 5 years of her life that had gone up in one long orange night while she stood in the road and watched it and could not make her feet move fast enough to save anything at all. She did not tell him that version. Instead, she watched the country go by. Grass going gold at the edges already, though summer was not near done with them yet. Far hills with snow still clinging stubborn to the shaded sides. A hawk turning slow circles over nothing in particular. Kestrel, she thought. He named the place for a bird that hunts by staying still and watching. There's something in that. Or there isn't. Stop reading signs into everything, Verity. You always did that. Read signs into things that were only ever things. You're quiet, Thad said, not looking over. I'm thinking. About the job? About the last one. He waited. Did not push. She noticed that, too, filed it away, with the rest of the small evidence she had been collecting on him since the freight yard. Evidence for a case she had not decided yet whether she was building for him or against him. I had an in, she said finally, because the silence had gotten heavier than the truth would have been. 5 years. Little place. 9 rooms, a good kitchen, regulars who came back twice a year like clockwork. What happened to it? Fire. The word came out flat. Flatter than she meant it to. Flat the way a thing goes when you have said it so many times in your own head that saying it out loud cost almost nothing anymore. Almost. Lamp oil, she said. A storm knocked a shelf loose in the night. I woke to smoke instead of the bell. By the time I got everyone out, the whole east wing was gone, and by morning the rest went with it. Everyone got out. Everyone got out. Except the inn, she thought. Except 5 years. Except the money I had put back for my sister's passage west, which I never told her about. Because how do you tell somebody the thing you were saving for them burned down along with everything else? So I didn't tell her. I let her think I had simply stopped writing, which was its own kind of lie. The kind that eats quiet from the inside, where nobody has to watch it happen. Louisa still writes to the old address, or she did. I stopped checking after a while. Because a person can only read the words, "Why haven't you answered me so many times?" Before she starts believing, there is no good answer left to give. She stopped that thought. Again, she was getting practiced at it. My family took it hard, was all she said out loud. Harder than I expected. Why? Because I was the one who was supposed to have finally landed somewhere. Steady. Doing well. She looked out at the grass. Turns out steady burns just the same as anything else. Thad did not answer right away. When he did, his voice had gone lower, careful in a way that was not pity. She knew pity's voice by heart. This was not it. I lost my father 2 years back, he said. Left me the station and about $400 of debt he never once mentioned owing. A short breath, almost a laugh, with none of the humor in it. Man ran that place 30 years and never wrote. A figure down he didn't have to. I've been drowning in his silence ever since. You didn't serve with him. I served 2 years. Infantry, tail end of the war, came home in '65 to a father who acted like I'd been off fishing. A pause. We didn't talk much after. About the war or the books or anything else. He'd ask if I was eating enough, and that was the whole conversation. Some weeks. And now he's gone and left you both. Both. The wagon rattled on. Somewhere off to the west, thunderheads were building slow and gray, the kind that might come to something by evening or might blow themselves out over the mountains and never reach them at all. Do you have people? Verity asked, surprising herself. She did not usually ask. Besides the station. A cousin in Ohio I write twice a year, that's the whole of it. He glanced at her, quick, then back to the road. You? A sister. Louisa. Verity watched the grass move. She's in Ohio, too, as it happens. Or she was. Last I had a firm address for her. You don't write. I don't know how to write to somebody and tell them nothing's changed when everything has. She heard the honesty of it land in her own ears a half-second after it left her mouth and was surprised at herself for saying it plain instead of folding it smaller the way she usually did. It's easier to let the silence do the explaining. Cowardly, but easier. Louisa's last letter had asked, plain as anything, whether Verity intended to come home for Christmas or simply intended to keep disappearing a little more each year until there was nothing left of her to visit. That was the word she used. Disappearing. Not lost, not busy. Disappearing like a woman fading out of her own photograph, one corner at a time. Verity had read it twice by lamplight, in a rented room, in a town she no longer remembered, and had not answered it, and had told herself she would answer it once things were settled. Once she had something worth writing down. A place, a wage, a reason Louisa might read the letter and feel proud instead of merely relieved. She was still waiting for that reason. She had been waiting for that reason for the better part of 2 years, which was, she supposed, its own kind of dishonesty dressed up as patience. Thad glanced over at the silence, stretching a beat too long, and did not ask what had caused it, which she was beginning to understand, was simply the shape of the man. He let things sit. He did not go digging in a person's quiet the way some men did, hunting for something to fix or something to pity. Does sound cowardly to me. What does it sound like? Sounds like a woman who's been given more reasons than she deserves to expect the worst answer back. Verity said nothing to that. There was nothing safe to say to it. She only looked at the hills a while longer and let the quiet between them settle into something that was not quite comfortable yet, but was, for the first time in longer than she could easily remember, not unbearable either. I know that feeling, she thought, watching the clouds building slow in the west, building towards something you can't tell yet if it's going to be rain or nothing at all. She did not say it out loud. Some things you keep for yourself, just to see if they are true, before you let anybody else decide what to make of them. Kestrel Station sat where two wagon roads crossed a low stretch of open ground, and it did not look like much, either, though it looked like a different kind of not much than Larkspur Crossing had. A long timber building, fronting the road, gray-boarded, roof patched in 3 different colors of shingle, like a man mending his own coat with whatever scraps came to hand. Behind it, a stable, a repair shed leaning a few degrees off true, and a wagon yard rutted deep where iron wheels had turned the same circle 1,000 times. An old man was sitting on an upturned crate by the stable door, working a harness strap with an awl, and he looked up when the wagon came in and did not look glad to see it had a passenger. Amos Pruitt, Thad said, climbing down. Runs the stable, mends what breaks, and generally lets me know when I've made a fool decision before I find out for myself. Amos set the awl down slow, looked at Verity a long moment, long enough that she felt the old familiar tightening start behind her ribs, the bracing foot feeling she knew the shape of the way she knew the shape of her own hands. But his eyes did not go to her face first, either. Interesting. They went to her hands, to the bag, to the boots caked in Larkspur Crossing mud. You the new cook. I'm the new cook. Huh. He picked the awl back up. Mealroom's been losing this station money since spring. You fix that, I'll shake your hand. You don't. Well, he shrugged, went back to the strap. Reckon I'll still shake it. Just slower. That, Verity thought, is the closest thing to a welcome I have gotten in longer than I want to count. She almost smiled. Almost. You've been here how long, Mr. Pruitt? She asked, because it seemed the kind of thing worth knowing about a man she would apparently be working alongside. Since before this one was old enough to shave, he nodded at Thad without looking up. Knew his father. Buried his father, near enough, seeing as the man wouldn't call for a doctor till it was 3 days too late to matter. Amos. It's the truth, and she'll hear it from somebody eventually. Might as well be me, first, plain, instead of some Teamsters version, with the ugly parts left off. Verity found she liked him already, in the particular way a person likes someone who has decided not to bother softening the world for her, because a world that has not been softened is at least a world she can trust to keep behaving the same way tomorrow. Inside, the mealroom told a story of its own, and it was not a flattering one. 3 cups sat abandoned on the counter, one of them growing something Verity did not care to name. The shelves in back held more empty space than stock. A chalkboard nailed, crooked to the wall, listed prices in a hand that had clearly stopped caring what those prices added up to. Where's your ledger? She said. Thad pointed to a shelf behind the counter, where a single battered book sat wedged between a coffee tin and a broken lantern. She opened it standing right there in her traveling coat, because some things could not wait for supper, and what she found in the first 3 pages told her everything the empty shelves already had. Beef bought heavy every week, whether the traffic called for it or not. Flour bought light always and always at the last possible moment, at whatever price the moment happened to demand. Teamsters running credit that never got collected, page after page of names with no second column beside them, no mark that said paid. You've been feeding half your custom on faith, she said. I've been feeding half my custom because I can't stomach turning a hungry man away. That's a fine instinct for a church. It's a poor one for a business. He looked at her sideways. Something flickered there. Not offense. Closer to relief, the particular relief of a man who has been waiting a long while for somebody to finally say the true thing out loud, instead of around it. You always talk to a man this way on your first evening in his employ. Only when the ledger's this bad. Fair, he said and reached for his hat. There's a room off the back for you. Small, but it locks and it's dry. I'll let you get settled. Amos will show you where the well is. He paused at the door, half turned back, Miss Coombs. Mr. Rourke, glad you counted those sacks today. He was gone before she could answer, boots on the porch boards, and Verity stood alone in the meal room, with a bad ledger and an empty shelf, and something in her chest that had not felt this, much like standing on solid ground in longer than she could easily remember. Careful, she told herself. That night, lying in the narrow bed, in the small dry room, listening to the wind test every loose board on the roof. Careful, careful. You have felt solid ground before. It has given way before. It will very likely give way again. She believed that. She let herself, just the same. For one night, not act like it. She woke before dawn out of old habit and found Amos already up, forking hay in the stable by lantern light, and she stood in the doorway a moment before he noticed her. Couldn't sleep, she said, by way of explanation. New bed does that. He did not look up from the fork, or new job, or a face full of things a body doesn't say out loud to strangers. He glanced at her then, quick, not unkind. Which was it? All three, probably. Huh. He kept forking. Rourke's father used to say the same thing. First year he took this place over from his own daddy. Couldn't sleep a whole month. Then one morning he just did, and never mentioned it again. And I never asked him, why the change, on account of a man's sleeps being his own business. Is that your way of telling me it passes? It's my way of telling you. I've seen it pass before. Don't rightly know, if that's the same thing. She found she liked that answer better than a false comfort would have served her. A false comfort could be taken back, later, when it proved untrue. An honest uncertainty, offered plain, cost a person nothing to keep believing. Over the next several mornings, a pattern began to settle between them. The way patterns will, quietly, before either party has quite agreed to it out loud. Amos would be at the stable before light. Verity would pass through on her way to the well, and he would grunt some fragment of the day's coming weather, learned from 40 years of watching the same hills. And she would grunt something back about the day's coming meals, learned from 15 years of watching the same hungry faces, and between the two of them, a station that had been running on nothing but Thad's exhausted goodwill began, slowly, to run on something sturdier. You'll do, Amos told her, on the fourth morning, apropos of nothing, not looking up from the bridle he was mending. You said that already. With the harness. Said it different that time. Meant it the same. He tied off the leather, tested it once with both hands. Difference is, I've watched you 4 days now, instead of 4 minutes. Man can say a lot of fine things about a stranger. Takes longer to say them about somebody he's actually watched work. It was not much. It was, Verity thought, walking back toward the meal room with the sun only just beginning to lift pink along the eastern hills. Quite a lot more than not much at all. That night, unable to sleep again, she lit the stub of a candle and took paper from the small store she kept at the bottom of her bag, and she wrote, at the top, Dear Louisa, and then sat a long while, looking at those two words, as if they might rearrange themselves into something easier if she only waited long enough. I have found a position, she wrote finally. A freight station, 12 miles south of a crossing called Larkspur. The owner is a fair man. The work is honest. She stopped. Read it back. Struck through fair man and wrote, above it, a good man, and then sat looking at that correction longer than she cared to admit, because it had come out of her hand before her better sense had a chance to stop it. I think of you often, she wrote next. I think of the passage money more often than I ought, and I am sorry for it going the way it went, and sorrier still that I let 2 years pass without telling you so plainly. I did not know how to write a letter that admitted the fire, without admitting everything the fire took along with it. I am not certain I know how to write that letter even now, but I am trying. This is me, trying. She read it over once more by the guttering candle, and then very carefully, very deliberately, she folded it in half, and in half again, and set it Inside, the same hymnal page where she had once kept the money meant for exactly this sister, exactly this reconciliation, and she did not seal it, and she did not address it, because sealing it would have meant deciding to send it, and she was not yet brave enough for that particular arithmetic. Soon, she told herself, blowing out the candle. Once there's something steadier to report than hope. She had told herself soon before. She was aware of that, lying in the dark listening to the wind. Aware of it the way a person is aware of a debt long overdue, carried so long it has stopped feeling like an obligation and started feeling like simply a fact of the household, unpleasant, familiar, easy to walk past without looking at directly. Soon she thought again, and this time, for reasons she could not entirely name, she almost believed herself. Morning came gray and cool, and Verity was up before the sun the way she had been up before the sun for 15 years running, some habits outlasting even the buildings they were built in. She spent the first hours simply looking at the shelves, at the stock, at the chalkboard prices that made no sense against the actual cost of anything sitting behind them. Coffee 5 cents, bread and beans 10, beef plate 15, pie 10. Why is bread and beans the same price as bread alone would run you, she asked, when Thad came through for his own breakfast. People don't argue it, neither do your debts. And look how well that's serving you. He almost laughed into his coffee, nearly choked on it instead. You always this hard on a man before he's finished his first cup? Only the ones who need it. She spent the better part of an hour. After that, walking the shelves, with the ledger open in one arm, matching what sat in stock against what the board claimed it cost to serve, and the more she matched, the plainer portrait the shape of the trouble became. Your beef cost you more than your beans return, she said, when Thad came back through. You buy it heavy because Teamsters ask for it loud, and loud men make a kitchen feel busy, even when busy isn't the same as profitable. Men need meat. Men need to eat. That isn't the same claim, though most of them would swear otherwise if you asked them plain. She tapped the ledger. Look here. A beef plate costs you near what it sells for, once you count the spoilage, on a slow day. A bean plate costs you a third of that, and a hungry teamster eats it just as fast and complains just as little, provided it's hot and there's bread alongside it. So we sell fewer beef plates. We sell whichever plate the day calls for, and we stop pretending every day calls for the same one. She turned to a fresh page. Cut the beef order by a third this week. See what's left over Saturday. If nobody starves and nobody complains past the ordinary grumbling a man does about anything free of charge, we'll know the number was fear, not need. Thad studied her a long moment, the particular look of a man recalculating not just his ledger, but the whole shape of who he had hired to keep it. You did this before, at your own place. I did this before because I had to. An inn with 9 rooms doesn't forgive a woman who guesses instead of counts. She closed the ledger, gentler than she'd opened it. I'd rather guess right the first time here than learn the hard way twice in one life. He did not ask what the hard way had cost her the first time. She was grateful for that. In the particular quiet way a person is grateful for a question that never gets asked. By mid-morning, she had found a length of scrap board in the repair shed and a jar of white chalk gone half to dust, and she nailed the board up beside the counter where it could be seen from both sides, and on it she began marking simple tallies, one line for each order taken, grouped by what was ordered, so that, even in the crush of a crowded hour, nothing could be forgotten, and nothing could walk out the door unpaid. Amos watched her hang it with open suspicion. That going to feed anybody? It's going to make sure the people who do get fed also get charged for it. Huh, he said again, which she was beginning to understand, was the full range of his early approval, and went back to his harness strap. The first real test came just past noon, when 4 wagons rolled in together, more than a dozen teamsters climbing down all at once, loud and hungry and in no mood to wait. Verity stood at the counter and did not let herself flinch when the first man's eyes caught on the left side of her face, and stayed there half a second too long. What'll you have? She said, before he could decide what to say instead. He blinked. ordered beef and coffee, same as most men, and moved on down the counter without further comment, which was, Verity had learned, the very best of first meeting, usually managed. Not every man managed that well. Near the back of the second wagon's crew stood a broad-shouldered freighter who took one look at her, then made a show of turning to the man beside him and asking, loud enough to carry, whether the station had anybody else back there who could serve him instead. The room went quiet in that particular way. Rooms do when everyone has heard something ugly and is waiting to see who answers it first. Verity set down the chalk. "There's only me today," she said, even and unhurried, the way she had learned, over 6 towns in 3 years, to say the hardest sentences of her life. "You're welcome to eat elsewhere if that doesn't suit you. Continental's yard is 11 miles on. I hear their coffee's cold and their bread's 2 days old, but I understand a man has his standards." A short bark of laughter went up from somewhere near the door. Then another. The freighter's face went red, and he did not laugh, but he also did not leave, and after a long moment he stepped up to the counter and ordered beans, quiet, and did not notarized again, and Verity marked the tally and moved to the next man like nothing at all had happened, because in the accounting that mattered to her, nothing had. A meal had been ordered. A meal would be paid for. The rest was only weather, and weather passed. Thad had come out from the back partway through it, and he was standing very still, near the kitchen door, jaw tight, like a man deciding whether the moment called for him to speak, and finding to his own visible surprise that it had not needed him to. By the time the wagons pulled out an hour later, every plate had been paid for, and not one order had gone missing in the noise. "Well," he said, when the room went quiet again. "Well, what? That's more than we took in most whole days last month. A beat. And you handled Deacons better than I would have. I'd have thrown him out the door and lost the fare. Throwing men out doesn't pay debts, Mr. Rourke. Feeding them does. Even the ones who need reminding of their manners first." He looked at her a moment, something working behind his eyes that she could not quite read yet, and did not ask him to explain. This could work, she let herself think, just once, just quietly later, wiping down the counter as the light went long and gold across the yard. This could actually work. She should have known better than to think it out loud, even inside her own head. The second day brought fewer wagons but more regulars, the kind of quiet, steady traffic that told a person more about a business's true health than any single crowded hour ever could, and among them came a lean, gray-whiskered freighter named Hollis Bell, who took his coffee blackened, his bread without butter, and had, by all appearances, not smiled since some time before the war. He studied the chalkboard a long moment. "New system," he said. "Not a question. New system. Old Cook never wrote a thing down. Half the time I paid for beans I never got, other half I got beans I never paid for. Never did work out if that balanced in my favor or his." "It didn't," Verity said. "Not in anyone's. That's rather the point of writing things down." Hollis grunted, which she was learning, was the universal currency of approval among the men who passed through this particular stretch of Montana, and ordered his coffee and bread exact, and sat at the end of the counter eating in a silence that felt, by the second week, less like indifference and more like company. The kitchen, in those early mornings, became its own kind of sanctuary, steam rising off the coffee kettle before light, the particular smell of bread just past the point of raw, filling the whole long room with something that felt, if a person let it, almost like the smell of a life being rebuilt one loaf at a time. Verity found she liked the ache in her shoulders by the end of a full day, liked it the way a person likes proof of something, evidence that she had done real work, moved real weight, fed real hungry men who would come back tomorrow expecting the same steady hand behind the counter. No questions asked about anything but whether the beans were hot. There was a comfort in that kind of repetition. She had not let herself feel, in a long while, the predictable weight of flour in her palms, the rhythm of knife against board, small physical certainties in a life that had handed her precious few certainties of any other kind. Belle hasn't sat at that counter 2 days running. In the whole time I've owned this place, Thad told her quietly. Once the old freighter had gone. Man usually eats standing up. Says sitting slows a body down. Maybe the coffee's better. Maybe, Thad said, and looked at her, a moment too long before he found something urgent to do with the crates instead. Not every visitor that week came hungry, and not every visitor came kind. On the 5th day, a well-dressed woman rode in on a fine gray mare, alone, a rancher's wife by the cut of her traveling coat, and she stood in the doorway a full 10 seconds before she came any further, the way a person stands at the edge of water, testing whether it is warm enough to bear. I heard, she said to Thad, though her eyes had already found Verity and stayed there, that you'd taken on new help. I have. My husband runs cattle north of here. Comes through this way twice a month with his hands. Expects a decent meal when he does. Her gaze had not moved from the left side of Verity's face, and her voice had gone careful in the particular way voices go careful right before they say something a person has already decided not to be talked out of. I'll admit, I'm curious whether that arrangement will hold once the men see who's serving it. The room did not go quiet this time. It had already been quiet. Only Amos at the far end, nursing his coffee, and he set the cup down now, with a small, deliberate click against the counter. Mrs. Calder, Verity said, even before Thad could answer for her. I don't believe we've met. We haven't. Then you'll forgive me if I don't yet know your husband's tastes. Beef or beans when he comes through. I like to have a man's order ready before he's finished tying up his horse. Saves him waiting. Mrs. Calder blinked, thrown, visibly, by an answer that had refused the shape of the conversation she had come prepared to have. Beef, she said after a moment, almost reluctant. Beef, then. I'll remember it. Verity held her gaze, steady, unhurried, the way she had learned, over 3 long years, to hold a gaze that wanted very badly for her to look away first. Was there anything else, Mrs. Calder, or will that be all for today? For a long moment, nobody spoke. Then Mrs. Calder turned, without another word, and rode back out the way she had come, and Amos let out a low breath that might, in a man less careful with his approval, have been mistaken for a laugh. She'll be back, he said. Women like that always come back. Curiosity gets the better of the meanness, eventually, especially once the beef's good enough. And if it doesn't get the better of it, then she eats at Continental's yard 11 miles on. Same as anybody else fool enough to choose cold coffee over a warm welcome. He picked his cup back up. Her loss to carry, not yours. Thad had said nothing through the whole exchange, and when Verity glanced at him, she found him watching her with an expression she could not immediately name. Something between pride and something that looked uncomfortably close to the beginning of tenderness, and she looked away first this time, back to the chalkboard, back to the safer arithmetic of tallies and coffee and bread. Careful, she reminded herself, marking a line that did not need marking, just to have something for her hands to do. Besides, notice how that particular look had made her feel. Thad found her later, after Amos had gone to check the horses, and the meal room had gone quiet with evening, and he stood near the doorway a while before he spoke, in that way of his, working out how plainly he meant to say a thing before he let himself say it at all. I ought to have said something to her, he said. Mrs. Calder ought to have told her plain there wasn't a discussion to be had. You'd have made it worse. How does a man make that worse? By turning it into his fight instead of a fact she has to sit with on her own ride home. Verity kept her eyes on the chalk in her hand, on the tally lines, because it was easier still to say certain things while looking at something else. If you'd spoken for me, she'd have gone home telling herself the poor scarred woman needed a man to defend her. This way, she goes home, having lost an argument to me directly, with nobody's charity standing between us. That's a harder thing for a woman like her to sit with. Good. Let her sit with it. He was quiet a moment. Does it get easier? He asked. The way people look. She set the chalk down. No, she said, simple, because she had decided somewhere in the last 3 years that lying about that particular question served no one, least of all herself. You only get better at not letting them see what it costs you. That isn't the same as easier. It only looks the same from the outside if a person isn't paying close attention. I've been paying attention. I've noticed. You look surprised, saying that. I am, she admitted, and it cost her something to say it plain. The way honesty, about a thing long guarded, always costs something the first several times a person tries it. Most men either stare too long or look away too fast. You've done neither. It's a small thing. I keep telling myself it's a small thing. She looked up at him. I am having a harder time believing that, the longer I stay here. Something moved across his face, unguarded again. The same look from the counter the night he'd told her about the boy in his company. And for a moment, neither of them said anything at all. The quiet stretching out comfortable and uncomfortable both at once. The particular kind of silence that exists right before two people decide, without a word passing between them, that something has changed and neither one intends to pretend otherwise. For what it's worth, Thad said finally. Lo, I stopped seeing it as the first thing about you sometime around the flour sacks. Took me the whole wagon ride south to admit that to myself. I'm only now getting around to admitting it out loud. Verity did not trust her voice to answer that plainly, so she did not try. She onlyed once and picked the chalk back up and let the moment settle into the quiet company of everything else in that mealroom. She had decided, somewhere in the last 8 days, she was not yet ready to walk away from. By the end of the first week, the chalkboard tallies had filled and been wiped clean 7 times over, and the coffee tin no longer sat half empty by Thursday, and Amos had taken to eating his own supper at the counter instead of alone in the stable, which, Thad informed her, dryly, was the closest thing to a formal endorsement the old man had ever given on anyone in the 11 years they'd worked together. This could work. Verity let herself think again, quieter this time, more careful, the way a person tests ice a second time after the first crossing held. She should still have known better than to think it, even quietly, even carefully, even inside her own head. Near the end of that first week, a rider passed through carrying nothing but news, which was its own kind of cargo out on that stretch of road, and the news he carried set Thad planked the length of the counter half the evening after. Federal Survey, he told Verity, laying a printed notice flat under the lamp. Postal Service is looking to name official relay stations along this whole stretch, Larkspur crossing clear through to the Missouri crossing. Whichever stations get named, get the mail contract. Regular runs, regular pay, government money that doesn't dry up when the cattle season does, and whichever don't. Keep scraping by on freight traffic and hope for the best, same as we've been doing. He tapped the notice. Surveyman's meant to come through sometime before first snow. Look at the roads, the water, the buildings. Decide which crossings are worth the government's coin and which aren't. How many stations between here and the Missouri crossing? 4, that I know of. Kestrel, Continental's Yard, 11 miles on. 2 smaller outfits past that I've never had reason to visit. Continental, Verity repeated, and something in the way Thad's jaw tightened at the name told her this was not the first time it had come up between him and trouble. Biggest outfit on this stretch of road. Deep pockets. Deeper still since they took on outside money a year or 2 back. He folded the notice with more care than the paper strictly required, the way a man folds something he intends to return to, often. If the survey names Continental's Yard as the relay station and passes us by, we'll be fighting for whatever traffic they don't want, which is to say, not much traffic at all. Then we'd best be worth naming. That's the whole of my plan, near enough. He almost smiled. Wasn't much of a plan before you got here. Was mostly hoping. Hope isn't nothing, Mr. Rourke. It's just poor arithmetic on its own. Thad, he said again, quiet, the correction becoming something closer to habit between them now than instruction. Thad, she allowed. That evening, with the last of the light gone orange and low across the wagon yard, Thad found her still at the counter, tallying the day's figures onto a clean page by lamplight, and he stood in the doorway a moment before he came in, the way a man does when he has something to say, and has not yet decided how plainly he means to say it. 31%, she said, without looking up. More than yesterday. If it holds a week, you'll have enough to clear last month's flour bill outright. That's good arithmetic. It's good arithmetic married to a great deal of luck. Don't build the winter on one day, and don't build it on two. He came the rest of the way in, poured himself the last of the coffee, which had gone bitter hours ago, and drank it anyway, which told her something about the kind of man he was, that his words had not yet quite gotten around to telling her themselves. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "You can ask. Why'd you take this? Counter work. After everywhere else made you stand behind a wall for it." He turned the cup slow in his hands, not looking at her, giving her the room to answer. Or not that she noticed, he seemed to give her about most things. "You could see plain enough I was desperate. You could have asked for more than 2 weeks' trial. More than Saturday wages." Verity set the pencil down. "Because you looked at the sacks first," she said, "before you looked at me. It's a small thing. It shouldn't matter as much as it does." She looked up at him. "But I've learned to take these smalls when they're honest, Mr. Rourke, because the large kindnesses mostly aren't." He held her gaze a moment, did not look away. Again still, the same steadiness she had first noticed in the freight yard mud a day and a lifetime ago. "Can I tell you something I don't tell most people?" he said. "You can. The war." He turned the cup again, slower now. "Last winter of it, we were dug in outside a town I couldn't point to on a map today if you paid me. Cold enough the ink froze in the pens. And there was a boy in my company, 17, if he was a day, though he swore up and down to the recruiting officer he was 20. Face like a schoolboy still. Everybody looked out for him, without ever quite saying so out loud, because saying it out loud would have meant admitting how young he really was, and admitting that would have meant sending him home. By then, none of us much believed in home anymore. Not the way we had at the start." Verity said nothing, only listened, the way she had learned certain stories asked to be listened to, without interruption. Without the reflex, most people had to fill a silence before it could finish doing its work. "He didn't make it home," Thad said. "Neither did about a third of the company, by the end. And I came back to a father who wanted to know if I'd learned anything useful out there. Useful the way he meant it, meaning useful for running a freight station. And I never did find the words to tell him what I'd actually learned instead." He looked up at her, which was that most of what a man spends his life protecting isn't worth protecting nearly so much as the handful of people standing next to him while he does it. That's not nothing to have learned, no. Just wasn't the answer he was asking for. A short, tired breath. "I don't tell people that. About the boy. Don't rightly know why I'm telling you now." "Maybe because I didn't ask," Verity said, quiet. "People tend to say the truest things when nobody's gone digging for them." He looked at her a long moment, something unguarded sitting plain in his face that she suspected he did not often let anyone see there. And something in her own chest answered it before she could decide whether answering was wise. "Thad," he said, quiet. "Thad," she allowed, and something in the room shifted half an inch, the way rooms do sometimes. For no reason either person in them could fully name out loud. It was into that half-inch of quiet that the horse came in. A good black horse, ridden hard enough to be lathered, but not so hard the rider seemed to mind it. And the man who swung down from it wore a coat too clean for the road he had traveled, and he did not tie up at the rail so much as leave the horse standing there like he expected someone else to see to it. Thad's whole posture changed the moment he saw him through the window. "Barrett Vance," he said, low, mostly to himself. The man came up onto the porch unhurried, a leather folder tucked under one arm, and when he stepped inside, his eyes moved once around the room, the fresh chalkboard, the counter, Verity standing behind it, and something in his expression sharpened like a man recalculating a number he had thought was settled. "Rourke." A nod, easy, almost friendly. "Making changes, I see. What do you want, Vance?" Vance set the folder on the counter and did not open it right away. Let the silence sit there instead, the way a man lets a debt sit before he calls it due. "I've been out at the county recorder's office," he said. "Interesting reading. Your father's old land filing. Very interesting. Get to it. Vance smiled and opened the folder and turned it around so the papers faced the square across the counter. Your northern boundary, he said, isn't where you think it is. Hasn't been, legally speaking, since 1868. And the way I read this survey, Mr. Rourke, half this station you're standing in tonight sits on land, Ramons. That was never rightly filed as yours at all. The room went very still. Verity's hand, resting on the edge of the chalkboard, stopped moving. Outside, the wind picked up once, rattled the loose shingle on the roof, and let it drop. That's not possible, Thad said, but his voice had lost its footing somewhere in the middle of the sentence. My father filed that claim the year the territory opened. I've seen the paper myself. Your father filed a claim. Sure enough. Vance tapped the top sheet with one gloved finger, unhurried, a man enjoying the sound of his own patience. Filed it against a survey line that got redrawn 2 years later when the territory office corrected an error in the original section markers. Common enough mistake back then. Half the claims filed before 68 got shuffled some, north, south, a few rods either way. Most men never noticed. Most men's stations weren't sitting close enough to the old line to matter. And mine is. Yours, Vance said, sits almost dead center on top of it. Amos had come in from the stable somewhere, in the middle of this, drawn by the quiet, the way a man is always drawn to a silence with weight in it, and he stood now just inside the door with his arms folded, watching Vance with the flat, unblinking look of a man who had buried one Rourke already and did not much care for the notion of what watching trouble circle the next one. Who sent you out here with this, Vance? Amos said. County recorder don't generally ride personal messenger service for strangers' land filings. Not unless somebody's paying considerable for the privilege. Something flickered behind Vance's easy smile. There, and gone so quick, Verity might have imagined it, if she had not spent 3 years learning to read exactly that kind of flicker on exactly that kind of face. I have business interests along this stretch of road, Vance said. It's in my interest to know which stations are standing on ground and which aren't. Call it professional curiosity. Call it what it is, Amos said, which is a man hoping to buy trouble cheap before he sells it back, dear. I haven't offered to buy anything, Mr. Pruitt. Not yet. Vance's smile did not move, but something behind his eyes did. A small recalculation. The look of a man filing away a name to remember later. Unkindly, he turned back to Thad. I'd have this looked at by a lawyer, if I were you. Soon. These boundary matters have a way of resolving themselves, whether a man's ready or not, and it generally goes better for the party who moves first. He closed the folder, but left it sitting on the counter, a small cruelty dressed up as a courtesy. You can keep the copy. I had it made especially. How generous, Thad said, flat. I try to be a reasonable man, Rourke. Reasonable men do well out here. It's the stubborn ones who find the country hard going. His eyes moved once to Verity, taking in the chalkboard, the tallies, the counter she stood behind, with a kind of assessing coolness that had nothing to do with her face at all, and everything to do with what her being there apparently meant about how the station was being run now. You've made some interesting improvements, I hear. Word travels out this way, faster than a man expects, sometimes. Is that a threat, Mr. Vance? Verity asked, before she had fully decided to ask it. It's an observation, Miss Coombs. He said her name like he had gone to some trouble to learn it beforehand, which unsettled her more than any open threat could have managed. I only observe that a station worth improving is a station worth someone else wanting. You'd do well to remember that, working here. I generally remember most things, Mr. Vance. It's rather the whole of my usefulness. For just a moment, something almost like respect crossed his face, cold and assessing, gone as quickly as it came, replaced by the same unhurried courtesy he had worn walking in. I'd read it carefully if I were you, he said to Thad, already turning for the door, already sure of exactly how the next silence was going to sound, before somebody else reads it first. He was gone into the last of the light before either of them found the words to call him back. For a long moment, nobody in the mealroom moved. Amos was the first to break it, crossing to the counter, picking up the folder Vance had left, turning the top page toward the lamp to read it himself, lips moving slightly over the surveyor's cramped notation, the way a man reads something he badly wants to be wrong about. "He's lying," Thad said. "Not quite a question. Men like that don't need to lie," Amos said, setting the papers down slow. "Truth bent just enough serves him better. Cost less comes cheaper if anybody ever checks his work." He looked up. "Doesn't mean the boundary's really moved, mind. Just means we can't prove it hasn't. Not tonight. Not with what's sitting on this counter." Thad sat down heavily on the stool behind the counter, the folder open in front of him, and for a moment he looked less like a man who had survived 2 years of war and more like a boy who had just watched something solid go soft beneath his feet without warning. Verity set the chalk down finally, came around the counter, did not touch him, did not know yet if that was a thing she was permitted to do, but stood close enough that he would know, without her needing to say so plainly, that he was not sitting with this alone. "We'll read every line of that paper," she said. "Together. Tonight if we have to. Tomorrow if we don't. You don't know the first thing about land filings, Verity." "No," she agreed. "But I know a great deal of bring bad news dressed up nice and leave, before anyone can ask the second question. And the second question is always the one that matters, Thad. It's the one he was hoping nobody would think to ask until he was already gone." He looked up at her. "What's the second question?" "Why now?" She held his gaze steady. "A boundary that's supposedly been wrong since 1868 doesn't suddenly become urgent. 4 years later, on the very week a man starts turning a losing station into one worth watching. Men like Vance don't chase bad land, Thad. They chase good land that hasn't finished proving itself valuable yet, hoping to take it cheap before the proving's done." Amos looked at her a long moment, something shifting in his face, the last of his early wariness folding quietly into something closer to alliance. "She's not wrong," he said. "No," Thad said slowly, looking down at the papers again, reading them now not as a man defeated but as a man beginning, however unsteadily, to look for the seam in another man's lie. "She isn't." Outside, full dark had come down over the wagon yard, and the wind had settled, and somewhere off toward the road a nighthawk called once, and went quiet, and Verity Coombs stood in a meal that had, in the space of short days, gone from the sixth town that had turned her away to the first place in 3 years. She found herself unwilling to simply let go of without a fight. Careful, she told herself. Again, one last time, watching Thad turn the survey papers slow beneath the lamp. She did not listen to herself. Not this time, because she had spent 3 years learning exactly how much a person could lose. The inn, the money, the easy trust of a sister who deserved better letters than the silence Verity had given her. She had learned that lesson so thoroughly she could have recited it in her sleep, the whole bitter arithmetic of it, subtraction after subtraction, until there was almost nothing left to take. What she had not learned yet, standing in this small gray station at the crossing of two dirt roads, is, with an unfinished letter folded inside a hymnal and a folder full of some stranger's lie sitting open on the counter, was what a person did with the opposite problem. What a person did when something finally unexpectedly began to add up instead. Amos gathered the papers, said something gruff about morning, coming early, regardless of what fool business men like Vance got up to after dark, and went out toward the stable, and Thad sat a while longer at the counter, and Verity banked the fire, and blew out all the lamps but one, and neither of them said much that night, because some things did not need saying yet, only surviving, one quiet evening at a time, until the saying of them became the easier and more obvious thing to do. Outside, the Crossroads sat dark and empty under a sky, gone thick with stars, waiting, the way the Crossroads always wait, patient and indifferent, for whoever came down either road next to decide which way the whole of it was going to turn. Neither of them slept that night, because there is no sleeping through a thing like that. A folder full of somebody else's handwriting, deciding, calm as anything, whether the ground under your own boots still belongs to you. Thad read the survey papers 3 times by lamplight. Then a fourth. Verity watched him do it and said nothing, because some silences are a kindness, and some silences are only waiting, and she had learned, over 3 years, exactly which was which. Something's wrong with the date, she said finally. He looked up. What date? The correction. Vance said the boundary got redrawn in 1868. Look at the filing stamp. She turned the page toward him, finger under the ink. This says notarized. 3 weeks ago. Silence. Long enough that the lamp hissed once and neither of them noticed. 3 weeks, Thad said slowly. Since I hired you, since the sacks got counted right for the first time in a year, and this station stopped losing money quite so fast. Verity set the page down. Careful, like it might still bite. That's not a coincidence, Thad. Men don't rediscover an old survey error the same month a losing business starts turning a profit. They go looking for one. Once it's worth the trouble of finding. You're saying Vance had this filed. I'm saying somebody did. Whether it's true or false is a separate question entirely, and it's the one that actually matters. But the timing. She shook her head slow. The timing isn't an accident. It's a strategy. Thad rubbed a hand hard across his face, the gesture of a man who had not slept and did not intend to pretend otherwise. My father would have known what to do with this. Your father let the ledgers rot for 30 years, and never once wrote down what he owed. I don't think your father is the man to be measuring yourself against tonight, Thad. It came out sharper than she'd meant it. She watched it land. Watched him decide visibly, not to take offense at it. No, he admitted. Maybe he isn't. Then measure yourself against the man who hired a stranger off a muddy road because she counted sacks right. That man's done well enough so far. Trust him a while longer. Because that's the only comfort I actually have to give tonight, she thought, watching him fold the papers away. Not a lawyer. Not a lever to pull. Just faith in a man who hasn't given me reason yet to withhold it. Which frightens me more than the boundary line does, if I'm honest. Except I'm not going to be honest about that tonight. Tonight is for surviving until morning. They rode out to the land office at Copper Ridge to see the original filing for themselves. A hard day's ride there and back. Amos left minding the station, the chalkboard covered over, with a scrap of canvas like a thing put to sleep early. The road ran east through country that grew leaner the further they went, sage and dry grass, and long empty stretches, where a person had nothing to do but think, which, Verity found, that particular stretch of road was not always a mercy. You've gone quiet again, Thad said, somewhere past the 2nd hour. I'm doing arithmetic. On what? On how many times in my life a piece of paper has decided something about me before I had a chance to argue with it in person. She kept her eyes on the horizon. A deed. A filing. A doctor's note about my mother's health that decided on. On paper she'd live another year. And didn't. Paper has a way of feeling more true than it deserves to, simply because somebody bothered to write it down first. You think Vance's paper is a lie. I think Vance's paper is a weapon somebody sharpened on purpose. Whether the metal underneath it is true or false almost doesn't matter, once it's already cutting. The clerk there was an older man named Whitlock, ink-stained to the 2nd knuckle, who did not look up from his ledger until Thad said the word boundary, and then he looked up plenty. Rourke, he said. Kestrel Station. Somebody else asked after that exact filing. Recent. Who? Didn't give a name I'd swear to in court. Paid the fee for a certified copy, quick and quiet, gentleman's coat too fine for the road he'd come off of. Whitlock's eyes flicked to Verity, then back, incurious, which after 3 years felt almost like a kindness itself. Struck me odd at the time. Don't get many strangers caring this much about a boundary nobody's argued over in 4 years. 4 years, Verity repeated. The correction itself claims to date from then. Sure enough. Whitlock tapped the entry with one ink-stained finger, but it never got properly notarized till 3 weeks back. Same week, near as I can tell, this same fellow came asking after a certified copy. Old claim. New paper. New interest. Arriving all at once. He shrugged. That's the part that's new. Would you recall his name if I said one to you? Thad asked. Vance. Barrett Vance. Whitlock considered, chewing the end of his pen a moment. Didn't sign the request himself. Sent a man to do it. But I'll say this. He tapped the ledger. The fee was paid in banknotes drawn on a Helena account. Continental Freight keeps its accounts through that same bank. I've cashed enough of their drafts over the years to know the paper when I see it, even without a name attached. Thad's jaw tightened. That's not proof. No, Whitlock agreed. It's a thread, is all. Man wants proof, he pulls on it long enough to see where it leads. Outside, walking back to the horses, quiet in the particular way he went quiet, when something had confirmed a fear instead of easing it. He's manufacturing a claim, he said, or exploiting one that was always half true and never worth the trouble of chasing before. Verity swung up onto her horse, steadier at it now than she'd been the first week. Another small thing she hadn't noticed changing until it had. Either way, Thad. He needs this resolved before something. That's the piece we're missing. Not whether the boundary moved. Why now matters more than the line ever will. They did not find the answer to why now at Copper Ridge. They found it 3 days later, and it found them first. Business at Kestrel Station had been climbing steady for 2 weeks. Then, without warning, it wasn't. A wagon that should have stopped rolled past instead, dust settling slow behind it, driver's eyes fixed dead ahead, like the station wasn't there at all. Then another. By the third afternoon of it, Verity stood behind an empty counter with a full pot of coffee going cold, and Amos came in from the yard with his jaw set in a way she hadn't seen on him yet. Words going around Larkspur Crossing, he said. Ugly word. What word? That the meal here's gone bad since new help came on. That men who eat here get sick. He spat the last part like it tasted foul just saying it out loud, which is a lie, and every man who's actually sat at that counter knows it's a lie. But a lie only needs a week's head start on the truth to do its damage, and this one's had near 2. One teamster did come through that afternoon, a man Verity had served twice before, without incident, and this time he stood in the doorway a long moment without coming further in. Heard some men took sick eating here, he said. Not unkind. Just careful, the way a man is careful of a rattlesnake he has only heard about secondhand. From who? Man at the depot in Larkspur Crossing. Didn't give a name. Did he give you a description of what these men supposedly caught? A fever? A cramp? Anything a doctor could put a word to? Verity kept her voice level, because rage would only confirm whatever fear had brought him to the doorway in the first place. Or only the word sick, passed hand to hand until it was too vague to argue with. He shifted, uncomfortable. Only the word. Then eat here today, and judge for yourself or don't, and go on believing a stranger's story instead of your own stomach. Either way, I won't hold it against you. But I'd rather you decided on evidence than on gossip, because gossip's cheap, and my cooking isn't. He ate, said little, paid exact, and left without further comment, and Verity marked the tally with hands that did not shake until well after he was gone. Verity's hands went still on the counter, because she knew this shape. She had seen this shape before, in 5 different towns, wearing 5 different faces, always arriving right when things had finally started to work. Vance, she said, or somebody paid by him. Doesn't much matter which hand held the pen. Thad came in on the tail end of it, and his face, when Amos repeated the rumor, went a color Verity hadn't seen on him before. Not embarrassment, not doubt. Something closer to fury, banked low and dangerous, the kind a man carries quiet until it has somewhere useful to go. I'll ride into Larkspur Crossing, he said. Find out who's spreading it. Put a stop to it myself. You'll do no such thing. He looked at her, surprised. You go in there swinging accusations, Verity said, and every man who half believes the rumor already gets to watch the station owner lose his temper defending the woman he hired. That doesn't kill the story, Thad. It feeds it. She came around the counter. Let me handle Larkspur Crossing. How? The only way I know how to handle anything. She reached for her shawl. By feeding people and letting them decide for themselves what's true. Mrs. Odell answered her own back door same as always, and her face, seeing who stood on the step, did something complicated and unhappy in the space of half a second. Miss Coombs. Mrs. Odell. Verity held out a covered basket. Bread, still warm, wrapped in cloth. I've brought your boarders something. No charge. Consider it a courtesy. One kitchen to another. I don't want trouble, neither do I. I want your boarders to taste bread that was baked this morning by the woman they've apparently been told makes men sick. And I want them to draw their own conclusions. Mrs. Odell's eyes narrowed, some of the old defensiveness climbing back into her voice. You think I started that talk? I think you didn't have to. I think somebody else started it, and it found willing ground in a town that had already decided, once, what to make of my face. Rumors don't grow in soil that hasn't been turned over first, Mrs. Odell. You turned this particular soil the day you took my apron back. The words landed harder than Verity had planned them to. She watched Mrs. Odell absorb it, chin lifting then, slowly, lowering again. That's a hard thing to say to a woman. It's a hard thing to have lived through 6 times over. I'd say we're even on hardship, if you'd care to compare notes. Verity kept the basket out, steady, unmoving, the same steadiness she'd learned from a man who never once looked away first. You turned me away once, Mrs. Odell, fairly, by the only measure that seemed to matter to you at the time. I'm not here to relitigate that. I'm only here to ask you not to let a lie about my cooking finish what your doorway started. Something in Mrs. Odell's face shifted. Small. Reluctant. Who told you it was a lie about your cooking specifically? Nobody had to. It always is. Verity set the basket down on the step between them. It's never really about the food, Mrs. Odell. You know that better than most. She turned and walked back down the road before the woman could answer, because she had learned the hard way that the best exits leave a person no room to argue with them afterward. The bread worked exactly as far as bread can work, which was to say it bought a little goodwill and lost none. 2 wagons that had been avoiding the station started stopping again within the week. Hollis Bell, who did not involve himself in gossip on principle, made a point of eating a second, helping in front of 3 men he knew had been repeating the rumor, chewing slow, saying nothing, which turned out to be more effective than any speech Thad could have given. Mrs. Calder came back, too. Alone, same gray mare, same careful distance in the doorway before she came all the way in. My husband's hands say the beef's good, she said, by way of greeting. It generally is. I told them they were fools for listening to Larkspur, crossing gossip in the first place. A pause, stiff, like the words cost her something to produce. I include myself in that. I was a fool the first time I rode through here. Verity did not make it easy for her, exactly, but she did not make it hard either. Beef, then, she said, for your husband's crew, same as before. Same as before, Mrs. Calder agreed, and something in the exchange, small as it was, felt like a debt quietly settling itself, without either party needing to say the word sorry out loud. It was, Verity thought, watching the woman ride off, about as close to an apology as pride like that ever allowed itself to come. She should have let herself enjoy the small victory longer than she did, because 2 days later, the flour stopped coming. Latham's mill had supplied Kestrel Station for 11 years, longer than Thad had owned the place outright, and when his boy rode up that morning, with an empty wagon and an apologetic look, Verity knew before he said a word. Pa says he's sorry, the boy said. Says he's got no choice. No choice about what? Continental. He said the word like it embarrassed him to carry it. They told Pa if he keeps selling to Kestrel, they'll take their whole contract to the mill over at Copper Ridge instead. Pa can't lose that contract, ma'am. Not, and keep the mill running through winter. There it is, Verity thought. The why now. It was never only the land. It's the survey. Vance means to starve this station thin before anybody ever walks its boundary line with a measuring chain, so that, whatever the survey finds, there's nothing left standing worth naming. She did not say any of that to the boy. He was not the one who deserved to carry it. Tell your father I understand, she said instead. And tell him I said thank you, for 11 years of flour and one honest apology at the end of it. That's more than most men manage." He rode off looking relieved, and Verity stood in the empty yard, doing arithmetic she did not care for. "I have done this before," she thought, and let herself have it, just this once, standing alone where nobody could watch her face do whatever it needed to do. "I have stood in an empty storeroom before, and counted what was left and known, before I finished counting, that it was not enough. I told myself, that time, that the fire had taken the choice away from me, that there was nothing left to manage because there was nothing left, period. This time, there is something left. 1 sack, half a tin. Beans for 3 days if the wagons stay light, which means this time the choice is still mine to make. And I am done. I have decided, standing in yards like this one, letting men like Vance make my choices for me, simply by taking things away faster than I can replace them. 1 flour sack left, less than half a tin of coffee, beans enough for perhaps 3 days if the wagons stayed light. Because if we close," she thought, and stopped herself, and started again slower. Because closing even a week hands Continental exactly the empty station Vance needs for his survey argument. Which means we don't close. Which means I find flour somewhere Continental hasn't thought to threaten yet. Except I don't know this country the way Thad does. Except I don't know these farms. Except Odette Finch does. The dry goods shop in Larkensproxen smelled like cedar and coffee, and underneath both, faintly like the particular satisfaction of a woman who has never once been wrong about a supplier in her professional life. "Flour," Odette Finch repeated, when Verity laid it out plain. "Continental's squeezing Latham, and you need flour that doesn't run through Continental's hands to get to you. That's the whole of it." Odette leaned back against her counter, arms crossed, studying Verity a moment, with the frank, assessing look of a woman deciding how much of her own hard-won knowledge she was willing to hand over for free. "You know, Continental's been leaning on more than one supplier along this road," she said. "I've had my own visit from a man in a fine coat, asking pointed questions about who I sell flour and coffee to, and how much of it ends up at Kestrel Station. I told him it was none of his business, which it isn't, but I'll admit it rattled me some, having a stranger keep that close an accounting of my ledgers. I'm sorry to have brought that trouble to your door. You didn't bring it. Continental did. There's a difference, and I'd thank you to remember it, because I intend to." Odette's mouth curved, sharp and pleased with itself. "There's a widow farms wheat 6 miles north of here, Mrs. Iverson. Small acreage, good grain, sells mostly to herself, and whoever asks kindly, because nobody with real money ever has." Odette's eyes had the particular gleam of a woman solving a problem that also happened to annoy people she disliked. "She'll want cash. No credit, no promises. She's been burned by promises before. I have cash. Not much. Enough. Then you'll have flour by Thursday, and Continental can choke on the arithmetic of it." Odette pulled a scrap of paper toward her, began writing directions in a fast, sure hand. "I never did forget the flour sacks, Miss Coombs. Been waiting for a chance to return the favor." Mrs. Iverson turned out to be a small, sharp-eyed woman, with flour permanently ground into the creases of her knuckles, and she studied Verity a long moment on her own porch before she said a single word. "You're the one Continental's trying to starve out." "I am." "Good." She said it, flat, no explanation offered, none needed, and led Verity inside, without waiting for an answer, setting 2 cups of chicory coffee down on a table scarred pale with years of use. "I've got no love for a company that told my husband, before he passed, that a widow's contract wasn't worth the paper it was printed on. Man came out here 2 winters back, told him straight to his face that Continental didn't do business with farms, that couldn't guarantee they'd still be standing come spring. My husband died that March. I've been guaranteeing I'd still be standing every spring since, just to spite the memory of that man's face. I'm sorry for your loss. I don't need the sorry. I need somebody who will pay cash and not lie to me about the weight of the sack." Mrs. Iverson studied her a moment longer. "You've got an honest face, whatever else people say about it. I've learned to trust the honest part and ignore the rest. Comes from 40 years of judging grain. instead of people. Grain doesn't lie to flatter you. Neither, I'd wager, do you. No, Verity said. I generally don't have the patience for it. Mrs. Iverson almost smiled at that, the first give in her whole flat, careful expression. Cash today, fair price, and you can have every sack this farm can spare, she said. And you can tell that Continental man, if he comes sniffing around again, that Iverson land answers to Iverson's terms, and no company's coat is fine enough to change that. They shook on it, standing in the yard, two women who had never met a week before, building something neither Continental nor Vance nor any rumor out of Larkspur Crossing had thought to account for. By Thursday, flour came up the road in Mrs. Iverson's own wagon, and Kestrel Station's shelves filled again, quiet, unannounced, with the best victories in a long fight often arrive. With the shelves full again, Thad turned his attention to the parts of the station a ledger couldn't fix. The roof, patched 3 different colors, and none of them sound. The stable door hanging crooked on one hinge. The sign out front, weathered so pale a rider could be forgiven for missing it entirely at any speed above a walk. If Continental's counting on us, looking half up abandoned, he said, standing in the yard with a hammer in one hand and a fresh cedar shingle in the other, we'd best stop obliging them. Verity found herself, that week, doing work she hadn't done since the inn, scrubbing the counter until the wood showed its true color again, instead of 11 years of accumulated grime, repainting the price board in a clean, even hand, sweeping the yard each morning until the ruts looked less like neglect and more like simply the honest wear of a business that saw real traffic. Amos took to the roof himself, muttering the whole time about young men who thought a hammer was a personality. You're enjoying this, Verity called up to him one afternoon, watching him drive a nail home with more force than strictly necessary. I'm enjoying watching this place look like something again, he called back. Man gets tired, watching a good thing rot slow for want of anybody caring enough to fix it. Is that what you were doing all those years? Watching, and waiting on somebody to finally show up worth the trouble of helping properly. He drove another nail, took its time arriving. But I've never much minded waiting on a thing so long as it's actually coming. Verity climbed partway up the ladder to hand him another shingle, and something in the quiet between hammer strokes made her ask the question she'd been carrying since her first morning at the stable. Why did you stay, Amos? All these years, a man could have found easier work than propping up a station that barely paid its own way. He did not answer right off. Set the shingle. Drove the first nail before he spoke. Had a wife once, he said. Long time back. Lost her the same winter I came to work this crossing. And Rourke's father, hard man that he was, never once asked me to explain my grief or hurry past it. Just gave me work with my hands and left the rest of me alone to heal at its own pace. Man doesn't forget a kindness like that, even from somebody who never learned how to say a kind word out loud in his whole life. He glanced down at her. This station's the closest thing to family I've had in 20 years. Family's worth staying for, even when the roof leaks. I understand that better than I'd like to. I expect you do. He drove another nail harder than it needed, which is why I'll say this once and leave it be. You're part of that family now, far as I'm concerned. Has been, since about the second morning, when you handed Deakins his beans instead of his ego. Don't much matter what the survey decides, or what Vance manages to scare up next. That part's settled already. Verity said nothing for a moment, because some kindnesses arrive too plainly to trust her own voice around right away. Thank you, Amos. Don't thank me. Just keep counting the sacks right. That's thanks enough for a man my age. It was into the middle of that week, sleeves rolled and hands raw from lye soap, that Barrett Vance rode past again. He did not stop this time, only slowed, at the edge of the yard, taking in the fresh shingles, the clean counter visible through the open door, the sign half repainted, and something in his face, brief as it was, betrayed a calculation quietly revising itself. Busy, he called. Not quite a question, not quite dismounting either. Busy enough, Thad called back, not pausing his work. I'd heard your flour supply had gone thin. Vance's horse shifted under him, restless, and he did not correct it. Rumors travel strange distances out here. So do lies, Mr. Vance. Seems the two keep similar company. Something flickered behind Vance's easy expression, gone as fast as it came. I only meant to wish you well with the survey, he said. Ought to be an interesting few weeks for this stretch of road. Interesting's one word for it. I can think of a few others. Vance touched his hat, unhurried, already turning his horse back toward the road. Good day, Rourke. Miss Coombs. He did not wait for either of them to answer, and Verity watched him go, the pale dust of the road swallowing him slow, and felt something settle low and cold in her chest that had nothing to do with the lye soap drying on her hands. He knows we're recovering faster than he expected, she said. He does. Which means whatever he tries next won't be patient. Patient men don't ride out twice in 1 week just to watch a fresh coat of paint dry. Thad set down his hammer, wiped his hands on his trousers, looked at her a long moment. Then we don't give him anything patient to work with either, he said. We finish this roof. We finish that sign. And when the survey man walks this ground in 3 weeks, he finds a station that looks like it's been standing solid its whole life. Boundary dispute or not. A drummer passed through, 2 days later, selling tin goods out of a wagon, crowded with pots and hinges, and small, hopeful luxuries nobody out here could quite afford, and he ate his beans slow, the way traveling men often did, glad of a place to sit that wasn't a wagon seat. You're the station Continental's been asking after, he said. Conversational. No malice in it. Man asked me, 3 stations back, whether I'd heard anything about Kestrel's condition. Asked awful particular questions for a stranger. Did he give a name? Verity asked. Didn't need to. Fine coat, finer manners, the kind of polite that costs a man something to keep up that long. The drummer shook his head. Between you and me, ma'am, that outfit's not near so steady as its coat suggests. Heard talk in Helena that Continental's investors back east have been asking hard questions about returns. Man like that, sent out here, asking about boundary lines and flour, contracts instead of sitting behind a desk somewhere, that's not a man secure in his position. That's a man trying to manufacture a win before somebody above him asks why he hasn't found one yet. Verity turned that over long after the drummer's wagon had rattled on down the road. A frightened man is more dangerous than a confident one, she thought, wiping down the counter in the day's last light. Because a confident man waits for the odds to favor him. A frightened man forces the odds and doesn't much care what breaks in the forcing. Which means whatever Vance tries next won't be his strongest move. It'll be his most desperate one. And desperate men, I have found, are considerably easier to catch in their own lies than careful ones ever are, she said, none of it, to Thad that evening. Some strategies needed a little longer to finish forming before they were worth speaking aloud. She spent the quiet hours of that same week building something else entirely. Not shingles, not paint, a different kind of proof, the kind she trusted more than either. She wrote to Mrs. Iverson, asking for a signed note of the flower sale, plain and dated. She rode into Larkspur Crossing and asked Odette Finch for the same. A simple record goods, supplied and paid, nothing more. She kept in a small tin box, beside the ledger, every receipt the station had generated since her first morning behind the counter, every tally sheet, every scrap of evidence that Kestrel Station was not merely surviving, but genuinely, measurably thriving. What's all this for? Thad asked, finding her sorting the box late one evening. For whoever comes to walk this ground in 3 weeks. She held up a receipt, careful, like it mattered more than its size suggested. Vance can argue about a survey line filed 3 weeks before he needed it to be true. He cannot argue with a widow's signature on a flower sale, or a shopkeeper's word that this station pays its debts in full and on time. Paper cut us once, Thad. I intend to make sure paper defends us next. You think a stack of receipts can be at a boundary dispute. I think a boundary dispute is a legal question, and legal questions take lawyers and time. Neither of us has to spare. But a surveyman deciding which station deserves a federal mail contract. She set the receipt down, squared the stack, That's not only a legal question. That's a question of which station looks like it deserves to still be standing come next winter. And I intend for the answer to that question to be written in more hands than just Vance's. Thad looked at the tin box a long moment, then at her, something in his expression settling into a kind of quiet certainty she hadn't seen on him before. You've been fighting this whole thing a step ahead of me, since the moment you counted those flour sacks, he said. I've been fighting most things a step ahead of everyone, Thad. It's a hard habit to unlearn, once it's kept a person standing this long. I don't want you to unlearn it, he said. I only want you to know you don't have to do the stepping ahead alone anymore. Not on this. Not on anything. If you'd let me walk alongside it instead. Verity did not have a ready answer for that. She only nodded once, and let the moment settle into the same quiet company as everything else in that meal room she had decided, weeks ago now, she was not ready to walk away from. That same night, alone in the small dry room with the candle stub burned low, Verity took out the unfinished letter, folded inside the hymnal, unfolded it, and read her own 2 months-old handwriting by the thin light. I have found a position, it still said, at the top exactly as she'd left it. I think of the passage money more often than I ought. She read it through once more, and then, instead of folding it away again, she reached for a fresh sheet. Dear Louisa, she wrote, I have more to tell you now than I did the last time I started. This letter lost my nerve before I could finish it. The station is not out of danger. A man wants the land under it for reasons that have nothing to do with fairness. And there is a survey coming that may decide, in 3 weeks' time, whether any of what I have built here gets to keep standing. I tell you this not to worry you, but because I have decided I would rather you know the true, uncertain shape of my life than a comfortable silence dressed up as nothing being wrong. What I can tell you plainly is this. I am needed here, not tolerated, not hidden behind a kitchen wall the way I was in every town before this one. Needed in the way a person is needed when her work catchy to the people around her, birthmark and all. I did not know, until it happened, how much difference there is between those two things. I am sorry it has taken me 2 years and 1 burned letter. I am trying to be better at this, at writing to you honestly instead of not writing at all. Your sister, still, whatever the silence may have suggested otherwise. Verity. She read it through twice, folded it properly this time, sealed it with a drop of wax from the same candle, and set it by the door, where she would remember, come morning, to send it out with the next wagon bound east. Soon, she thought, blowing out the candle, has finally arrived. It only took a boundary dispute and a stack of flower receipts to get me here. She slept better that night than she had in longer than she could easily remember. Thad found Verity that evening, counting the new sacks by lamplight, and he stood watching her a moment before he spoke. He noticed her hands first, red and cracked along the knuckles from days of lye soap and scrub water, and without a word he crossed to the shelf, found the small tin of Salve Amos, kept for the horse's saddle-galled skin, and set it on the counter beside her without comment. She looked at it, then at him. For the horses, she said. Works on people, too. Amos'll tell you, though he'd rather die than admit he's used it on his own hands, more than once. Thad nodded at hers. You've earned a little mercy for them this week. Verity turned the tin over once, oddly moved by so small a thing, and did not trust herself to say anything more graceful than thank you, which she said quiet, and meant more than the 2 words could carry on their own. You did that, he said. All of it, without waiting on me to fix it. You were busy fixing the boundary question. I fixed the flower question. That's how a station stays fed and standing both at once, Thad. Nobody does the whole of it alone. I know that. I'm only. He stopped. Started again. I'm only getting used to what it feels like, having somebody standing beside a fight, instead of just handing me the bill for it after. Verity set down the sack she was counting. That's what this is, she said. Quiet. Testing the shape of the word before she trusted it fully. Standing beside it. That's what it is. Neither of them moved for a moment. The lamp flucked, throwing long shadows across sacks that represented to anyone counting closely, considerably more than Flower. It was Amos who broke it, coming in fast from the yard, hat still in hand, breathing harder than a short walk. Should have cost a man his age. Ryder came through from Copper Ridge, he said. Left this for you. He held out a folded notice, official seal pressed into the wax, and Thad opened it standing right there, reading it once, then again, his face going carefully still in the particular way it went still right. Before delivering news he had not yet decided how to carry. Survey's set, he said. 3 weeks from Monday. They'll walk every station on this stretch of road, Kestrel included, and file their recommendation to the Postal Service inside the week after. 3 weeks, Verity repeated. 3 weeks to prove this station's worth naming. He looked at the boundary papers, still sitting on the counter where they'd sat, mostly, since the night Vance left them. And 3 weeks to prove this ground under it is actually mine to be standing on when they come to measure it. Amos looked between the two of them, something working behind his eyes. 3 weeks isn't nothing, he said. I've seen this place turn around faster than that. Once, a long time back, before either of you were old enough to remember it happening. When? Verity asked. Rourke's father. First hard winter he ran this station alone, before he had the sense to marry, before he had the sense to hire help at all. Nearly lost the whole place to debt inside a single season. Turned it around in less time than we've got now, on nothing but stubbornness and a run of good luck he never did deserve. Amos settled his hat back on. Difference is he did it alone, and near broke himself doing it. You two aren't alone. That ought to count for something, if the world's fair at all. The world hasn't been especially fair to either of us so far, Thad said, quiet. No, Amos agreed. But it's been getting fairer by the week, since this one walked up out of the mud with a basket and an opinion about your flower, Count. I'd call that worth something too. He left them to it, boots crossing back out toward the stable, and for a long moment neither Thad nor Verity said anything at all. 3 weeks, Verity said finally. 3 weeks. Then we'd best stop calling it a countdown to trouble and start calling it what it actually is. She picked the notice up herself, read the date once more, let it settle. A deadline, which is only trouble's more useful cousin, if a person's willing to work fast enough to beat it. Thad watched her fold the notice back along its creases, careful, the same careful way she handled everything that mattered to her. And something in his face softened into an expression she was only beginning to trust herself to name. 3 weeks ago, he said, I was a man drowning quiet in his father's silence, hoping nobody noticed how close to going under I actually was. And now I've got a station worth fighting for, a stableman who's decided your family, whether either of us asked him to, and a cook who counts flour sacks, like she's daring the whole world to try and take something else away from her. He shook his head, something almost like wonder in it. I don't know what to call 3 weeks like that. Frightening, maybe. But not only frightening. What else, then? Worth it, he said. Whatever happens when that survey man walks this ground. Worth it already just for what these last few weeks have been. Verity held his gaze a long moment, the lamp between them throwing warm light across a counter stacked with flour and receipts, and every small proof of a life quietly, stubbornly rebuilding itself. Ask me again in 3 weeks, she said soft, whether it was still worth it. I'd like to hear you say it once the fighting's actually finished. I intend to. Outside, the wind had picked up, carrying with it the first cold edge of a season turning, and some pour past the dark line of the hills. Verity thought a man in a very clean coat was almost certainly counting the exact same 3 weeks, and liking his own arithmetic considerably better than theirs. Because he's not only trying to win the survey, she thought, watching Thad fold the notice careful along its old creases. He's trying to make sure there's no station left standing to lose it to him honestly, which means the next 3 weeks aren't a countdown to an opportunity. They're a countdown to a fight neither one of us can afford to lose. The last week went fast, the way the last week of anything always does. Time behaving like a debt finally called due all at once, instead of collected slow the way it was borrowed. Because there was no more roof left to patch, no more sign left to paint. Only waiting now, and waiting. Verity had learned across 3 long years of it was the hardest work a person could be asked to do, with her hands unfolded, and nothing to show for the effort but a steady heartbeat. "You're pacing," Amos said, from the stable doorway, not looking up from the bridle in his lap. "I'm thinking. Thinking with my feet." He grunted, which she understood by now to mean he was choosing not to argue a point he'd already won, and went back to his leather, and Verity kept walking the length of the yard, boots wearing a shallow path into ground that had already seen enough disturbance for one season. 2 days, she thought. 2 days until a stranger walks this ground with a measuring chain and decides on the strength of numbers I have no say in whether any of this survives the winter. I have receipts. I have witnesses willing to speak. I have a station scrubbed clean and a stop sign painted fresh, and none of it will matter one particle if Vance's paper says this ground was never ours to improve in the first place. Which means the paper is the whole fight. Which means I have been building the wrong fortress. Which means she stopped walking, mid-stride, boot half raised, and stood there a foolish moment like a woman who'd forgotten where her own feet were meant to carry her. Except that's not entirely true either, is it? The receipts matter, the witnesses matter. Except none of it stops like Fop sitting quiet in a filing cabinet in Copper Ridge, waiting for a surveyor to read it as gospel, simply because it arrived on official paper first. Which means I am not fighting Vance's confidence. I am fighting the assumption that paper doesn't lie. And I have spent 3 years learning exactly how much paper can lie if the right hand holds the pen. So the question isn't whether I have enough proof of what this station has become. The question is whether I have proof of what Vance actually is. Because a thought had arrived, sideways, the way the truest ones always seemed to, and she stood very still in the middle of the yard, turning it over before she trusted it enough to chase. Vance didn't only manufacture a claim against Thad's land. He filed it 3 weeks before he needed it true, which took money and patience and a reason worth the trouble. Continental wants this stretch of road. Fine. But companies file claims through lawyers, through letterhead, through men paid to be careful. Vance came alone. Vance carried the papers himself. Vance rode out here twice, uninvited, to watch a station he claims not to care about with his own eyes. That isn't a company's patience. That's a man's hunger. "Amos," she called. "Has anyone bought land near Copper Ridge lately? New filings. Small parcels. Nothing a company the size of Continental would trouble itself over." He looked up, considering. Wouldn't know offhand. Whitlock might. "Then I'm riding to Copper Ridge again. Today." Whitlock did not look surprised to see her a second time, which told Verity something about how rarely surprising visitors made it out to his corner of the territory at all. "Back again. Miss Coombs. I need to see recent filings, small parcels. Anything bordering the Kestrel boundary line, filed inside the last 2 months. Chasing something particular, or chasing everything. Chasing whatever's willing to be found." He studied her a long moment, then pulled the ledger toward him without further comment, the particular courtesy of a man who had decided, somewhere along the way, that her questions were worth answering plainly. "Here," he said, tracing a line. 40 acres north of your northern marker. Filed 6 weeks back. Under what name? B. Wexford. Do you know a Wexford, Mr. Whitlock? Personally. Can't say I do." He turned the ledger a half degree, squinting at his own handwriting like it might yield more if he studied it harder, which is peculiar in itself. "I know most every name that files a claim inside 40 miles of this office. New names come through maybe twice a year, and generally with a story attached. A brother arriving from back east, a widow settling her husband's estate. This one came through with no story at all. Just a name, a fee, and a man who paid it, who didn't much look like he intended to farm 40 acres of anything." Verity felt something settle into place, quiet and cold, the way the last piece of a puzzle settles when the picture underneath has finally become impossible to mistake for anything else. "The fee," she said. "How was it paid? Whitlock checked the margin, and some cross T, something plus face that told her he'd already guessed where this was headed before he finished reading it aloud. Banknote, he said, drawn on a Helena account. Same bank Vance used for the boundary correction fee. Then B. Wexford doesn't exist, or exists only on paper, the same way Vance's boundary correction exists only on paper. A name to hide behind, filed 6 weeks ago, for 40 acres that only becomes valuable if the boundary he's disputing actually moves the way his own papers claim it should. That's a serious accusation, ma'am. It's an honest one, which men like Vance generally find harder to survive than the serious kind. She closed the ledger herself. Careful, final. He isn't only working for Continental, Mr. Whitlock. He's building himself a private fortune out of a company's fight and hoping nobody troubles themselves to look closely enough to notice the difference. I intend to trouble myself considerably, because that is the shape of it now, she thought, riding back toward Kestrel Station, with the sun going long and gold behind her. Not a company defending its interests. A frightened, greedy man, manufacturing a lie, broad enough to hide a smaller, uglier one underneath it. And frightened, greedy men, I have found, rarely survive having both lies discovered on the very same afternoon. Thad read the filing record twice by lamplight, the same way he'd read every piece of bad news that had come through that door since the night Vance first walked in, wearing his too-clean coat. Wexford, he said. You're certain. As certain as a ledger and a banknote can make me. Then he's been planning to profit off this personally, not only for Continental, which means the survey isn't only a fight for a mail contract anymore, Thad. It's the one chance we have to expose a man who's been lying to 2 masters at once, and neither of them, I'd wager, would care much for the arrangement if they knew the whole of it. Verity set the ledger notes down beside the tin box of receipts, 2 stacks of paper sitting side by side, like opposing armies finally drawn up for the same battlefield. Continental won't thank him for embarrassing them in front of a federal surveyor. And a federal surveyor won't take kindly to discovering the boundary dispute he's meant to weigh was manufactured for one man's private gain. You want to bring this to the survey itself. I want to bring everything to the survey itself. The receipts, the witnesses, and this. She tapped the filing record on once. Final. Let Vance explain Wexford in front of a man with the authority to write down whatever answer he gives. Thad looked at her a long moment, something unguarded moving behind his eyes. I used to think, he said, that the hardest part of running this place would be the ledgers, the debt, my father's silence, all of it. He shook his head slow. Turns out the hardest part was surviving long enough for somebody like you to walk up out of that mud and show me what actually fighting for something looks like. I had good reason to learn it early, Thad. I know. His voice went quieter. I'm sorry the reason ever had to be true. So am I, she said. But I'll admit, some nights, I'm almost grateful for the arithmetic of it. Every town that turned me away was a town that never would have led me to this crossing. I wouldn't trade the finding for the losing, even if I could. Neither of them said anything else for a while. The lamp, burning low, 2 stacks of paper between them, representing, by now, considerably more the single station's fate. The night before the survey, neither of them could settle, and they ended up sitting together on the porch steps instead of in their separate beds, the cold clear enough that their breath showed pale in the lantern light. What frightens you most? Thad asked. About tomorrow. That I've built my whole case on paper, and paper is exactly the weapon Vance already proved can be turned however a clever enough hand wants to turn it. Verity pulled her shawl tighter. I keep thinking of the fire. How certain I was, running back in for that ledger, that saving the right paper would save something larger than the paper itself. It didn't. The roof came down regardless. This isn't that fire. I know it isn't. I tell myself that plainly, several times an hour, and mostly I believe it. She looked at him. What frightens you, that everything I've only just started believing in again could still be taken tomorrow, before I've had the decency to say plainly how much it's come to matter. He didn't look at her when he said it, eyes fixed instead on the dark line of the road. doesn't seem fair somehow. Believing in something, only after the believing's already put at risk. That's rather how wanting anything worthwhile tends to work, in my experience. Cheerful thought. I've never claimed to be a cheerful woman, Thad. Only an honest one. He laughed, low, and some of the night's cold seemed to loosen with it. Honest better company than cheerful, most nights, he said. I'll take honest. They sat a while longer, without spiking, the frost settling silver over the yard. Two people who had built, in 3 difficult months, something neither Vance's lies nor a stack of manufactured paperwork seemed likely, come morning, to fully take away. Survey morning came clear and cold, the first true frost of the season silvering the yard, and Elias Sinclair arrived precisely on the hour named in his letter, a narrow, precise man with a measuring chain coiled over one shoulder and the unhurried manner of someone who had learned, professionally, not to be rushed by anyone's hope or anyone's fear. He had barely climbed down from his horse before Barrett Vance rode in behind him, unannounced, uninvited, dressed as ever in a coat that had never once seen an honest day's dust. Mr. Sinclair. Vance's voice carried the easy confidence of a man who believed the morning already belonged to him. I've papers you'll want to see before you walk this ground. A boundary irregularity, properly filed, that bears directly on whether this station even legally occupies the land it claims. Sinclair did not look especially moved. I'll review whatever's properly filed, he said. Same as I'll review whatever else is presented to me today. That's rather the whole of my function here, Mr. Vance. Verity stepped forward before Vance could press his advantage further. Then you'll want to review this as well, she said, and held out the tin box, steady, unhurried. Receipts, counts from local suppliers, and a land office filing, 6 weeks old for 40 acres directly adjacent to the disputed boundary, purchased under the name B. Wexford and paid for with a banknote drawn on the same Helen account Mr. Vance used to file his boundary correction. The yard went very still. Vance's easy expression did not move quite, but something behind it did. The small, involuntary flicker of a man watching a carefully built structure begin, without warning, to lean. That's a serious accusation to make in front of a federal officer, he said. It's an honest one, Verity said, which I understand men in your position sometimes find difficult to distinguish from the other kind. Odette Finch had ridden up sometime in the middle of it, unnoticed until she spoke, her own ledger tucked under one arm, like a woman who had come prepared for exactly this occasion. I'll add my own account, if it's wanted, she said. This same man came into my shop weeks back, asking pointed questions about who supplied Kestrel Station and how much custom it carried. Struck me odd at the time that a company representative would trouble himself so personally with a competitor's flour deliveries. Struck me considerably less odd now, hearing what you've just laid out, Miss Coombs. Sinclair took the box himself, opened it, read the top filing slow, his professional stillness giving way, briefly, to something sharper. Wexford, he said. Is that a name you'd care to explain, Mr. Vance? I've no knowledge of any Wexford. Then I imagine you'll have no objection to the land office confirming the signature on this filing against your own hand, Sinclair said, purely as a formality. Men with nothing to hide rarely object to formalities. I object on principle. A man's private business affairs are hardly the concern of a postal survey. They are, Mr. Vance, the very moment those private affairs happen to sit 40 acres north of a boundary you've asked me to weigh as evidence. Sinclair's voice stayed level, unhurried, the particular calm of a man who had clearly sat across from more confident liars than Barrett Vance in his professional life and outlasted every one of them. I'll ask you plainly once. Did you file the Wexford claim? Vance said nothing for a moment, and in that silence, Verity watched something in him recalculate fast, the particular arithmetic of a man realizing the ground he'd been standing on had just shifted considerably faster than any boundary line ever could. I have business interests. I'm not obligated to disclose to a station cook, he said finally, sharp, the first crack showing plain in his voice. You're not disclosing them to a station cook, Mr. Vance, Sinclair said. you're disclosing them, or failing to a federal surveyor, which I'd remind you is a considerably less forgiving audience. Verity said nothing further. She had learned across 6 towns and 3 years that the most effective silence a person could offer a cornered man was simply to let him keep talking until his own words finished the work for her. It was into that silence that a wagon rolled up the road, unhurried, and Mrs. Prudence Odell climbed down from it with a folded paper of her own clutched tight in one gloved hand. "Mr. Sinclair," she said, the name carefully. A woman unused to addressing federal officers and determined not to embarrass herself in the attempt. "My family's held the parcel neighboring this station since the territory first opened back in '64. I've a survey marker on my own property, set that very same year, that's never once been disturbed. I thought you'd want to know its location, given the argument being made here today." Verity felt something rise in her chest that she did not have a ready name for. "Mrs. Odell. I know what I said to you, Miss Coombs. On my own back step, weeks ago." Mrs. Odell did not quite meet her eyes, but she did not look away either, which Verity understood by now was itself a kind of courage for a woman like her. "I've had time to think on it since, on the difference between a decision made out of fear and a decision made out of fact. I'd like to make a better one today, if you'll allow it. I'd welcome it." Mrs. Odell turned to Sinclair, unfolded her paper, an old, careful hand-drawn survey her own father had kept, marking a stone corner still standing, undisturbed, on the boundary between her land and the Rourke claim. "That stone hasn't moved in 8 years, she said. "I'd stake my own deed on it, if the territory required me to." Sinclair studied the old drawing a long moment, then looked to Vance. "This predates your filing by considerably more than 3 weeks, he said. "I'll want to walk that corner myself before this morning's finished." Vance's jaw tightened. "An old woman's family drawing hardly constitutes a legal survey." "An old woman's family drawing," Mrs. Odell said, sharp enough to surprise even herself. "By the look of it, constitutes 8 years of a stone sitting exactly where my father said it, Mr. Vance, which is 8 years longer than your paperwork has existed at all." A short, surprised laugh went up from somewhere near the stable. Amos, Verity realized, not quite hiding his approval behind one raised hand. Mrs. Odell lingered a moment after, while Sinclair moved off to consult his own chain, and she stood near Verity with the particular discomfort of a woman who had more to say and had not yet decided whether saying it plainly would cost her too much pride to bear. "I turned you away," she said low, meant for Verity alone. "That morning. I've thought on it more than I've let on since. You don't owe me the thought, Mrs. Odell." "I believe I do. A woman doesn't get many chances to correct a wrong. She's done plainly enough that the correcting actually counts for something." She looked toward the stone marker, toward Sinclair crouched beside it with his chain. "This felt like one of those chances. I'm glad I took it." "So am I," Verity said, and meant it more fully than the simple words let on. They walked the corner together, the whole strange procession of them. Sinclair with his chain, Vance trailing behind, wearing an expression that had gone, by degrees, from confident to something considerably less comfortable. And there, exactly where Mrs. Odell's drawing had promised, stood a weathered stone marker, moss-grown, undisturbed, precisely where the original 1,864 filing had always claimed it should be. Sinclair measured it twice, wrote something in his own book, did not hurry, and did not need to, the silence around him doing more work than any speech could have managed. "This boundary," he said finally, "has not moved. Whatever correction was filed 3 weeks before Miss Coombs began improving, this station's fortunes appears, on the evidence before me, to have been filed in error. Or filed," he added, looking directly at Vance now, in something considerably less innocent than error. "I'll be speaking to my employers," Vance said stiff, already turning for his horse. "I imagine you will," Sinclair said. "I'll be including a note of my own findings in my report to the Postal Service, and a separate note to the Territorial Land Office regarding the Wexford filing. I expect both offices will have considerable interest in the coincidence." Vance mounted without another word, and for a moment, watching him, Verity felt something that was not quite triumph and not quite pity, some complicated third thing sitting between the two. Because a frightened man forces the odds, she thought, watching him ride out for the last time down the same road he'd first come in on, his fine coat doing nothing, now, to disguise how much smaller he'd become inside it. And a forced odd, once it's finally seen plain by somebody with the authority to write it down, has a way of collapsing all at once. The same way a fire collapses a wall that looked solid, right up until the moment it wasn't. I know that collapse better than most. I take no particular joy in watching it happen to somebody else. But I will admit, standing here, that I take considerable comfort in it happening to the right person, for once, instead of to me. Sinclair stayed the better part of the afternoon, reviewing the receipts, speaking with Hollis Bell and two other teamsters who'd stopped in unprompted, drawn by curiosity, and staying to offer testimony neither Verity nor Thad had asked them to give. "Best meal on this stretch of road," Hollis told him, flat. The way he said most things, which from Hollis Bell was closer to poetry than most speeches Verity had ever heard delivered with considerably more enthusiasm. "Ran here on time, every day, rain or not. That's worth more to a mail contract than any boundary line, seems to me." Sinclair wrote it down without comment, which Verity was beginning to understand was simply the shape of the man. And by late afternoon he closed his book, tucked it away, and looked between Thad and Verity with the closest thing to warmth his professional bearing seemed to permit. "I'll file my recommendation within the week," he said. "I don't generally make promises ahead of that filing. But I will say this much, plainly, since plain seems to be the preferred currency of this particular station." He nodded toward the counter, the chalkboard, the whole small, stubborn operation of the place. "I've walked 11 stations on this stretch of territory this season. I haven't seen another one worth naming quite this clearly." He rode out before either of them could find the words to answer that properly, and Verity stood in the yard a long moment after the dust had settled, feeling something loosen in her chest that had been wound tight for longer than the 3 weeks since Vance first walked through that door. The recommendation came 11 days later, carried by the same rider who'd brought the survey notice, and Thad read it once, silent, and then read it again, out loud, because some news, Verity understood, needed the shape of a voice to feel entirely real. "Kestrel Station," he read, "is hereby named official relay station for the territorial mail route, effective the 1st of the coming month." Amos let out a whoop that startled the horses, and Hollis Bell, who happened to be at the counter finishing his coffee, allowed himself something that might, in a more demonstrative man, have qualified outright as a smile. Word traveled fast. After that, the way word does when it finally has something worth carrying, and by evening half of Larkspur Crossing seemed to have found some excuse to ride out and see the station that had beaten Continental's yard for the government's mail contract, Mrs. Calder among them, and Odette Finch, and even, standing a careful distance back near the wagon yard, Mrs. Prudence Odell. Thad stood on the porch steps as the crowd settled, and when he spoke, his voice carried plain across the yard. No speech prepared, only the truth, said the way he'd learned to say most things since the day he hired a stranger off a muddy road. "3 months ago," he said, "this station was losing money every week. I couldn't stop it, and I hadn't the first idea how to fix that. I hired a woman that day who could count a flour sack faster and truer than any man I'd ever watched try it. And every improvement since, the chalkboard, the local suppliers, the receipts that beat back a lie built to bury us, every last piece of it belongs to Verity Coombs, not to me." He turned, found her in the crowd, held her gaze steady the way he'd learned to hold it from the very first afternoon. "I'd like the whole of Larkspur Crossing to know that plainly, since plain seems to be the only currency worth trusting anymore." The crowd was quiet a moment, and then slow, uneven applause started, awkward and real, The kind that comes from people genuinely surprised into giving it, rather than expected to. Verity felt her throat go tight and did not trust her voice, and did not, for the first time in longer than she could remember, feel the old bracing instinct rise up to meet a crowd's attention. Only warmth, only the strange, unfamiliar sensation of being seen, plainly, by an entire town, for exactly the work her hands had done, and none of the reasons she'd spent 3 years expecting instead. Mrs. Calder stepped forward from the crowd, her fine gray mare tied loose at the rail, and did not quite manage a smile, but managed, at least, an expression considerably warmer than the one she'd worn her first visit. "My husband's crew will be wanting supper," she said. "Beef, same as always. Same as always." Verity agreed, and something in the simple exchange, plain and ordinary as any order she'd taken in her life, felt like the truest kind of celebration the day could have offered her. Amos found her a moment later, hat in hand, uncharacteristically at a loss for the gruff, economical words he usually kept in reserve for exactly this sort of occasion. "Told you," he said finally. "First morning. Told you I'd shake your hand." He held it out, and she took it, and he shook it, slow and firm, the particular ceremony of a man who did not offer such gestures lightly and meant every second of the one he was offering now. "Family," he said, gruff, letting go before either of them had to find a graceful way to acknowledge how much small word had come to weigh. "Told you that too." That evening, once the crowd had gone, and the lamps had been turned low, Thad found her at the counter one last time. The chalkboard behind her, freshly wiped clean, ready for tomorrow's first tally. "I've been thinking on the heading," he said, nodding at the board. "What heading?" "The one over the tally lines. Been Rourke Station since my grandfather's day." He picked up the chalk himself, turned it slow between his fingers. "Doesn't seem honest anymore. Hasn't, if I'm truthful, seemed honest since about your second week here." He wrote slow and careful, above the empty columns, "Rourke and Coombs." Verity looked at it a long moment, the chalk still faintly dusting the air between them, and felt something settle in her chest that she recognized distantly as the particular shape of, finally, after 3 long years, arriving, and I'm somewhere she was not looking to leave again. "That's not only a business arrangement, is it?" she said, quiet, testing the shape of the question before she let herself trust the answer. "No," Thad said. "It never was, if I'm honest. I only needed the boundary settled first before I said the rest of it. Plain, say it plain, then." He set the chalk down. "Because I have waited 3 years for somebody to say a true thing to me plainly," Verity thought, watching him search for the words. "And I find, now that the moment has actually arrived, that I am nearly as frightened of hearing it as I ever was of being turned away, which is its own kind of foolishness, except foolishness has never once stopped my heart from doing exactly as it pleased, regardless of what my better sense advised. I don't want a partner who only manages my counter, Verity. I want one who manages the whole of the life built around it, if she'll have it. Flour sacks, chalkboards, every difficult morning and every easy one after." He reached for her hand, careful, the way he'd learned to reach for most things that mattered to him. "I've been a step behind you since the day you counted those sacks. I'd like to spend considerably longer catching up, if you'll let me." "You've caught up plenty, Thad. More than plenty. Then let me stay caught up. That's the whole of what I'm asking." Verity looked at their two hands together on the counter, at the fresh chalk headings still drying above them, at a station that had gone, in the space of 3 difficult months, from the 6th kitchen that would only have her hidden away to the first place in her whole life that had ever asked her to stand in plain sight and simply, finally, be seen. 6 towns, she thought. 6 doors that decided, before I'd said a single word, exactly what my face made me worth. And 1 crossroads, 12 miles south of the last one, that decided instead to ask what my hands could do, and then, slower, more carefully, what the whole of me might be worth beside it. I do not need to be rescued from anything standing here. I have already rescued myself 3 years running, 1 town and 1 ledger at a time. What I am being offered now is not rescue. It is simply, at long last, company. Yes, she said, and the word came easier than she'd expected any word to come, after 3 years of learning to expect so very little. Yes, Thad. He did not kiss her right away. He only held her hand a moment longer, steady, the same steadiness she'd first noticed in a muddy freight yard, a lifetime and 3 months ago. And when he finally did lean in, it was slow, unhurried, the way a man moves towards something he intends to still be holding carefully come morning. And Verity let herself, for the first time in longer than she could remember, stop bracing for whatever came next, and simply let it arrive. 6 weeks later, long after the fuss of the announcement had settled into ordinary routine, a different letter found its way to Kestrel Station, carried up from Larkspur Crossing with the regular post, and Verity recognized the handwriting on it before she'd fully opened the door to take it from the rider's hand. Louisa's hand, careful, lupin, unmistakable even after 2 years of silence, and the long, uncertain weeks it had taken a letter to travel from Montana Territory to Ohio, and an answer to find its way back again. She did not open it standing in the yard. She carried it inside, sat at the counter, and read it slow, the way a person reads something they have been afraid for a long while might never arrive at all. Dear Verity, it began. I confess I read your letter 3 times before I let myself believe it was truly from you, and not some trick of hoping too hard. I am glad, more than these few lines can properly carry, that you have found a place that sees your worth so plainly. I always believed you would, though I'll admit there were seasons I feared. I'd said that only to comfort myself, rather than because I still believed it true. Come spring, if the invitation still stands whenever you're ready to offer it, I should like very much to see the station myself. I should like to see the sister I have missed considerably more than my letters ever managed to say. Your sister, always. Louisa. Verity read it through twice, and then a third time, and did not try especially hard to keep the tears from. Finally, after 3 long years, arriving exactly when they were owed. Outside, the first true snow of the season had begun, soft and slow across the crossroads, settling gentle over a station that would, from that winter forward, carry both their names above the door. And somewhere beneath the falling white, a nighthawk called once into the dark and went quiet, the way it always had, patient and certain, waiting for whoever came down either road next to find, at last exactly, where they were always meant to stop.